I started this doodle in my sketchbook without any idea what the drawing would become, and then I thought it would be fun to reverse engineer a story to explain it, so that's what I did. Part 1. Members of the Order of the Keepers of the Secrets of the Cheesiverse are only allowed to have a name after they have passed the training phase and been given full priest status. Until then, any aspiring to become a priest was simply known as supplicant, in much the same way that a new military recruit is referred to only as private. Get on your feet, private, or get off my foot, private, or cover your privates, private. Bow your head, supplicant, or fetch my pail, supplicant, or stop that begging, supplicant. Much as some military recruits are ill-suited for a life of discipline and focus and following orders, there is the occasional supplicant who does not have the necessary humility to live the life of, well, supplication. Our supplicant, the supplicant at the heart of our story, was just such an individual. That individuality was in fact the heart of his difficulties, since supplicants, much like soldiers, are meant to be indistinguishable from each other. They are bodies fulfilling a role. They are tools to be used by the powers that be. They are a third thing to round out the rhythm of this statement. Once we have resigned ourselves to the fact that our supplicant had no intention of ever supplicating, and that his purpose in life was his own and not that of his so-called superiors, we can consider his greatest advantage to be his ability to deceive, though others in the Order of the Keepers of the Secrets of the Cheesiverse would consider this to be an unforgivable attribute if they had discovered it in time. Which they didn't. They discovered it too late. Right at the very last second, in fact, just as their little bubble in the fabric of the Cheesiverse came to an abrupt and permanent end. A flash of insight, a little characteristic squeak, and their pocket of reality ceased to exist. And yes, just to be clear, the ultimate destruction of their reality, the permanent cessation of all of everything in their pocket of existence, was 100% the fault of our supplicant, the protagonist of this half of our story. He became a faux supplicant against his will, he fooled everyone into believing he was sincere, and then, with no intention of doing so, he fucked everything beyond salvation. Not only did he bring about the end of the world, he brought about the extinction of the iteration of the Cheesiverse in which their version of the world existed. But only for everyone else, of course. He had no way of knowing that being the instigator of the cataclysm gave him the best chance of surviving it, especially since he didn't do it on purpose. He was the only one surprised by the result. The fact that he did in fact survive was purely chance, and perhaps the wrong kind of irony. Or not. Who can say? The only thing that can be said for certain is that if his father had known that forcing his son to become a supplicant would result in his own extinction, meaning the father's extinction, not the son, he, the father, would have forced him, the son, to apprentice a trade instead, become a weaver or a baker or a maker of toenail clippers. All our supplicant's father wanted was some peace from the relentless curiosity of his son. Father, what is this for? Father, how does that work? Father, who is this woman, and where has mother gone off to all of a sudden? Our supplicant embraced his namelessness well enough. It was the only part of monastic life that he didn't mind. That is not due to some existential angst as to the nature of the self. Rather, it gave him the opportunity to assign himself a nickname, namely Sup. Yes, he liked to think of himself as Sup the Supplicant. He stopped saying this to anyone after the first three failed to laugh, but inside his own mind, he still thought it was funny. It became doubly so when, thanks to a fantastically improbable instance of simultaneous invention, the phrase, "What is up?" came to serve as a form of greeting in our supplicant's bubble of the Cheesiverse to precisely the same degree as our own. When the phrase, "What is up?" was abbreviated to "Tsup," greeting our supplicant with an informal "What is up?" became "Sup, sup," and this pleased him very much. Though, again, it was only he who said this to himself, since no one else cared to play along with his stupid nickname to "Get away from me, you're supposed to be scrubbing the cesspit right now anyway." Sup was unbothered. He did not take offense. He kept himself entertained well enough without assistance. However, his curiosity was endless. It is fine that I'm not allowed a name, but why? He thought. Mother was certainly entitled to some time to herself, but why did she only speak to Father about this and not to me? And why did the house suddenly take on the smell of bleach the day after Mother departed? So Sup was exploring the corridors of the monastery during what he considered to be his free time, but which was actually what everyone else considered to be the middle of the workday, when he happened upon some sort of drama unfolding in whispers and furtive glances. Others, not his. He was silent, and he stared intently. He positioned himself between a decorative pillar and a structural pillar. He couldn't tell the two apart, and did not even know there was a distinction. He had assumed that they were all decorative, since they lined the inside of a corridor made of hewn stone. The monastery was a castle, after all. The decorative pillar cast a shadow on the structural pillar, and Sup concealed himself in the cover of this darkness. At the deepest part of this hiding place, Sup could peek through the tiny gap between the pillar and the wall with a clear view of an open doorway some 20 body lengths down the corridor. A priest was whispering animatedly to a high priest. The high priest was silent for a moment and then whispered something back. The priest nodded, then scampered away down the corridor. The high priest hurried up the corridor, clutching his heart and muttering worriedly to himself. Sup pressed himself deeper into his hiding crevice until all footfalls fell silent. He emerged with a glance in both directions, and then on tippy toes approached the doorway in front of which the priest and high priest had been whispering. Beyond the open doorway, angled shafts of sunlight sliced the room into a patchwork, broken into further pieces by the pattern of stones comprising the floor. Sup crossed the threshold. The room was literally empty. No people, no furnishings, no decorations of any kind that he could see, and certainly nothing that might have caused the kerfuffle that sent the priest and high priest scampering off in a tizzy. His eyes fell on the pattern of drifting motes that filled the shafts of sunlight, and he traced them upwards toward the ceiling, where he discovered the wonder of this room. From the ceiling, suspended by delicate chains, were countless vessels of the finest pottery. Each was identical, porcelain white. This was most certainly a sacred place, though he could not say why. His footfalls echoed loudly as he moved slowly across the chamber, but he did not hear them. He felt almost buoyant. He felt like he was floating through the space. He cast his eyes upward to see the vessels glistening in the intermittent light, but his sense of wonder was abruptly interrupted by some kind of resistance, a pulling, of friction. In slow motion, he looked down at his feet, and time snapped back to its proper speed. A slopping sound announced his next step. His sandal was sticking to the floor. A drip of something whizzed past his nose from above and splarped onto the stone next to his big toe. One of the vessels had a slight crack from top to bottom. A viscous liquid, the color and consistency of honey, was oozing from within. In a daze, Sup thought, "That looks like honey. I wonder if that's honey." It wasn't honey. The substance was very non-honey. In fact, nothing could be less honey than this honey-looking stuff. Sup had no way of knowing this. He couldn't have known what it actually was. But surging with curiosity as usual, he determined to confirm that it was honey. Of course it was honey. If it looks like honey, and if it tastes like honey, then honey it must be. So he decided to taste it, to confirm that it was what it obviously was, which was honey. The problem was, it wasn't honey. Sup noticed a series of chains, each secured neatly to the wall with a red tasseled ribbon. These were the working ends of the chains from which the porcelain vessels were suspended. He found the chain that controlled the vessel that leaked the honey not honey. He untied the ribbon and fed out the chain until the vessel was just above head height. The descent shook loose another drip of the honey-looking substance, increasing the size of the puddle on the floor by just that much. Sup approached the vessel slowly, holding the tasseled ribbon in front of him for reasons he himself did not understand. The next drip of the stuff that he thought was honey but wasn't really honey was nearing the point of dripping, so Sup stretched out his tongue to catch it. At precisely that moment, the whispering priest from a minute before stepped into the room, saw Sup with tongue outstretched. The priest inhaled a shocked breath in preparation to scream a warning, but the warning never came, because the priest did not exist, nor did the monastery, nor did the world on which the monastery stood, nor the bubble in the Cheesiverse in which their iteration of the world was hung. Part 2. Jenny spelled her name with an I and only one N instead of the traditional Y and two N's. This was her mother's doing. You don't have to change the spelling of a name to make a nickname. Just cut off the last part, her mother always said. The year after Jenny's birth, Jenny's mother's best friend Dolores had a baby girl and named her Jennifer, Jennyfer. She thought it was a clever joke. Jenny's mother did not agree. They are no longer friends. Jenny's mother had a better sense of humor about the ribbing she took from her husband and eventually from Jenny herself. Jenny's dad insisted on calling Jenny Jenny with a short I sound. He said, if you remove the N from Jennifer, you don't get Jenny, you get Jenny, like the sound of the letter I in the word nitpick, Jennifer. When Jenny was 8, she had her first exposure to the Star Wars universe. That same day, she dropped the extra N from her name and began pronouncing it Jedi in solidarity or kinship or something with the Jedi. Incidentally, the first film she watched from the Star Wars universe was the episode featuring the most irritating creature in the history of film on planet Earth, Jar Jar Binks. It is not only humans on our iteration of Earth who despise that floppy-eared diaper rash of a character, but every single conscious, sentient being who witnessed any of the countless versions of him who existed in every other bubble of the entire multiverse. Except one. There was one single solitary world in the multiverse where, purely as the result of probability, given that the multiverse is infinite with an infinite number of variations, the dominant species of the planet was nearly identical to the Jar Jar Binks in Our Earth's movie. The consensus on that lone world was something along the lines of,
"Who's a he, sir? He's a no special. Why is he in a decent movie?"
At any rate, Jenny saw the film when she was young enough that she was unbothered by the Jar Man, and so grew up tolerating him for sentimental reasons. Jenny's dad, on the other hand, could not resist verbally assaulting the television whenever Jar Jar appeared. Naturally, Jenny had jumped to the Jar's defense only for the chance to wind her dad up. It was a pleasant combative pastime they shared. Today is Jenny's dad's birthday, and she is looking forward to it. She had ordered his present months ago to make sure it arrived in time. Of course it got lost in the mail, sent back to the sender for no reason at all, then shipped out again. So she was relieved this morning when she got the text notification that it had finally arrived at the Packages and Stuff outlet store in the mall, where she rented a post office box. She was standing outside the pull-down gate when they opened at 11 a.m., and 90 seconds later she was walking back out the door with a brown paper package under her arm. Inside was a lifelike rubber mask of Jar Jar Binks, the linchpin of the practical joke she had planned for this evening. The thing about the mall is that for a female of Jenny's age and social status, she is always bound to encounter someone she knows there. They might as well conduct her classes in the food court for all the time she and her friends spent hanging out there compared to the amount of time they spent in actual classrooms. It was an obscene ratio. Including the weekends, they easily spent twice as much time in the food court. That was their inside joke. Rather than saying, "Hang out at the mall today?" someone would just say, "Obscene ratio," and the others would nod knowingly. Jenny's friend Rebecca worked at the fake jewelry kiosk after school, which stood directly across the food court from the Greasy Pizza, where the sub-captain of the football team worked. What does the sub-captain do? Is that even a real thing? Yeah, I fill in when the captain is out, so it's like just the same. I'm the captain sometimes when the captain's not there. His name was Brian, and he had the googly eyes for Rebecca. She and her friends never had to pay for their diet orange sodas. "I can't give you pizza or my boss will notice, and my mom needs the money so I can't get fired, but sodas get free refills so they can't track how much we use." Incidentally, Rebecca was jealous of Jenny's cool name, especially since she gave it to herself. Rebecca tried to modify her own name, first to Becca, then Bex. She tried Reba, like the singer with the last name McIntyre. She even tried to be really innovative and start with the last two letters, C-A, then circle back around to the beginning and tack on the first two letters, R-E. But that spells care, which is seriously hardcore lame, so she resigned herself to plain old Rebecca. Jenny wasn't trying to hang out today. She just wanted to get the Jar Jar mask and get back home to set up the rest of her dad's birthday surprise. She didn't care if that made her lame. She loved that old bastard, and she wanted his birthday to be amazeballs. Nobody says amazeballs anymore, but her dad thought it was funny. On her way back out to her car, she saw Brian across a parking lot trudging into work. On a Saturday, that sucks. She held up her fingers in a peace sign to say hello, and he did the same in return. When reality turned inside out, She had the nonsensical thought for a confused moment that her peace sign had triggered something, like she'd stumbled onto a magical conjuring gesture by accident. It wasn't a portal to another world that appeared next to her. It wasn't what she imagined a wormhole would be like when she overheard Trekkies talking about it. Jedi didn't feel that the intersection of the two worlds took place in a specific location. Later, when asked to describe it, turned inside out are the words that first came to mind. It felt like when she would reach into a plastic bag that a loaf of bread comes in, grab the bottom and pull it out through its own opening to shake all the crumbs loose, except the bag was her mind, and the hand was the fabric of reality, and the crumbs were a third part of the analogy she would decide sometime later. Her reasons for routinely inverting bread bags is a different story.
Mind your own business.
Impossibly, once the bread bag of her mind had been turned inside out, it continued inverting until it was back to normal again. You can't pull a bread bag so inside out that it ends up right side out again. That's physically impossible. Right side out would require reaching back inside and reversing the direction of the change. But apparently that's not the case for the fabric of reality. Apparently, the fabric of reality is analogous to a torus or donut shape that rotates outward along its originating line. Turning it inside out always brings it back to where it started. Jedi was trembling and frozen at the same time. Brian was staring at her from across the parking lot. The expression on his face was exactly the same as if he had been poleaxed with the handle of an actual axe. Presently, he shook his head as if to clear it and stared more intently, not at Jedi, but just past her. On a creaky neck, Jedi turned her head to the right until she saw, standing in the grass beside the sidewalk, a very odd-looking man with a broken neck. He was entirely devoid of color of any kind, except for the ribbon he held in his hand, which was the most brilliant crimson she had ever seen in her life. The man's eyes blinked rapidly and then found hers. He cleared his throat and opened his mouth as if to speak, said, "Sup," and pointed a shaky finger at himself. For his part, Sup's mind couldn't process what had just happened either. He had no experience inverting bread bags, so that image didn't come to mind. His world had no bread, and all the bags were made of leather or fabric or lethlekel, not that it matters. Sup's mind manufactured a conception of this intersection of worlds, this bridge between Bubbles and the Cheeseverse, and the destruction of his reality as a moment of disintegration or slowly blowing apart. The bricks of the monastery did not drift away from each other like objects in zero gravity, but that is how his mind chose to interpret the confusion for him. The girl in front of him only stared, mouth agape. Perhaps she hadn't heard him. He pointed a quavering finger at himself again and said, "Sup," more clearly this time, and waited. Jedi had nothing to say for a very, very long time, but when she did finally respond, her words caused an enormous smile to spread across the man's face. The end.